Hi, my name is Nico Heller. Good morning and good evening if you're joining us in Australia. My guest today is Professor Chris Hamer. Chris was our very first discussant on Reboot 2030 last October when we started a pilot program to see whether Reboot 2030 would have legs, would be a possible dialogue format for a new channel. We've been expanding since. We've had plenty of discussions, great dialogues, conversations, and it is a great pleasure to have Chris back today at the end of our first full season of interviews and dialogues. Chris is an honorary associate professor at the School of Physics at the University of New South Wales in Australia. He was formerly the National Secretary of Scientists Against Nuclear Arms, also in Australia, and he's presently the president of the Coalition for a World Security Community. Chris was talking about the Coalition for a World Security Community last October during our first dialogue. We'll be revisiting this briefly, just so that you can give us an update, and then we'll be looking at ways in which civil society might get more involved in this process, in this development. Now, I see that Chris is already here, so I'll invite him in and see how he's doing. Okay. He's joining. Day is coming on. Okay, there he is. Chris, good evening.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly well. It's a much more civilized time this time, isn't it?
It is. So I apologize for missing out on the previous schedule, but there we go. Yep.
I hope you're back to fully restored to good health.
I am. I'm even better than I was. So yes, I'm good.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm so glad to hear that. Chris, I just gave a very brief introduction. You know, it's quite fitting because you and I, we had our first dialogue when we started Reboot last October, and now we're having our second dialogue at the end of our first full season. So this really kind of, in a way, closes sort of a circle. And it's been an interesting journey. We've had great discussions, and I'm really glad to have you back. I mentioned that you are an honorary associate professor still at the School of Physics at the University of New South Wales, that you have a background in campaigning for peace and disarmament through the Scientists Against Nuclear Arms Association in Australia, and that you're currently leading the Coalition for a World Security Community. Let's return to that the current work you do, the Coalition for World Security Community. And just to give us an update, you talked about this like during our first dialogue, but maybe you could very briefly, in a few words, say what it is, how it works, and what its purpose is, just so that our viewers kind of get a sense of what we're talking about.
Okay, fine. So the idea is we're campaigning for a world security community of democratic nations, which would basically be an alliance of democracies. All for one, one for all, you know, an attack on one is an attack on all, etc. But with knobs on, if you like. So we'd also like to see it become a community following the European model. So following the model of yes, his name, anyway, the founders of Europe in 1950.
Jean Monnet.
Yes, Jean Monnet, that's the name. So I'm getting old, I'm afraid. Jean Monnet, Spear, etc. Spark, I'm sorry. So the idea is it would not only be an alliance, but it would have extra arms. It would have a parliamentary assembly, which would be the nucleus of an actual parliament. It would have a council. It would have the nucleus of a court, so a court to basically be the nucleus for a legal system. And it would, as far as possible, employ a system of qualified majority voting, like Europe does, so that no one country dominates, like the US, dominates discussions, but all have a voice in the community. So that's the basic idea. So the main purpose would be to assure the security of its members against the really alarming threats of autocracies at the moment. And secondly, it should form a very useful forum for making decisions on other common problems like climate change, as the European community did. And finally, it should form a stepping stone. So we're looking for it to be only the first stage in a process of political unification, if you like, maybe some sort of eventual democratic world federation.
So let me just come in here for a second. So I'm picking out a few elements here which seem quite central to this idea. The idea is to have a coalition of democratic nations. The emphasis being on the democracies of this world coming together, as opposed to whoever wants to join the club. So it is a much more specified, a much more, if you like, a value-based coalition than, say, for example, even NATO is at present, or indeed, say, the United Nations is at present. Now, this obviously raises questions about inclusivity and exclusivity, and where do you draw the line? What exactly is a democracy? I mean, is India still a democracy, and so on and so forth? So there's these questions that this raises, but of course, this is all part of the process, isn't it? To develop a kind of a consensus around who is in and who is out, and what we consider to be democracies, and at what point they kind of sort of tip into becoming sort of autocracies. Now, so that's the one issue that kind of seems to be popping out, is this question, really a global debate around what exactly do we mean by democracy and where do we draw the line? So that's a very viable discussion that seems to be developing along this. The second point that keeps popping out is security. Now, this is obviously where it is both very similar to, but also quite different from the European Union. It is similar in the sense that the European Union, the founding intent was very much of creating interdependency to prevent another world war and another Holocaust. So the idea was, if you create a very interdependent, integrated Europe, then European nation states will find it much harder in future to fight each other. There, the condition, there was a kind of a strong emphasis on democracy as well, very much so. But as we have seen with the expansion towards Eastern European countries, and most recently now with Ukraine, there was also always the possibility of countries becoming more democratized in the process. So there was this kind of process. Now, where it fundamentally differs, the driver in the European Union, of course, was the economy. So it was, it was kind of using economic integration as the first engine of integration, and it was built out from there, the single market, and so on and so forth. What you have in mind is not so much driven by economic concerns, although they do matter, but it seems more driven by security concerns. So security, defense against autocracy seems to be much more central in your proposal than it was, say, in the European one. And also Europe is very much concerned about itself. So it was about coming together to prevent that we fight each other, whereas here it's a kind of if you like, a common front against an external enemy. So there's another kind of fundamental distinction with the EU. Maybe you can elaborate or say a little bit about these points. So the first was this, what you draw the line with democracy and what is in and what is out. And the second one was whilst with Europe, this was about building internal alliances and internal peace and security, this would be very much almost the inverse. It would be building external security and defending against an external threat, i.e. autocracies such as China, such as Russia. Maybe you can elaborate on those two to sort of see where the differences and the similarities with the European Union and its founding ideas lie.
Yes, well, certainly the central idea is trying to prevent war, get rid of war on the global stage. So let me start with my motivation. So I'm basically a world federalist. I've always believed we're facing some huge global problems, nuclear weapons, climate change, war in general, as we've seen in Ukraine, ... there's lots more. You know, we can only solve those if we work together. That's obvious. So basically, that's what a world federation would be. We need some sort of global government to deal with these global problems. Now, but the second point is it has to be democratic because, first of all, the established democracies wouldn't accept anything less. And secondly, you know, a third, maybe more than that, of the world's people instinctively reject any idea of global government because they think of 1984 or Brave New World or these fictional ideas of, you know, swastikas, jackboots. They see tyranny as being equal to world government. So we need a democracy and, you know, very well-established, very unchallengeable democracy at the global level before we're going to get any sort of global government. Right. So that's my main motivation. The present time seems particularly urgent because I see there's an alarming similarity to the period before World War II. We're facing threats from the autocracies. Russia's actually invaded Ukraine. China is promising to invade Taiwan in a very few years. Japan's promised to defend it. President Biden has promised to defend Taiwan. And that could easily lead to World War III. And that would be the most destructive, the most catastrophic war the world has ever seen. So we need to prevent that. And the way to do that is to unite all the major democracies around the globe, which would then dispose of half the world's GDP, 2/3 of the world's military expenditure. That should be enough to dissuade or deter the autocracies from any further adventures. And so that would be the major motivation. Yes, that'll do for the time being. Oh, sorry, you asked me to define democracy. Well, I'm satisfied with, say, Freedom House, the ratings of Freedom House, or the criteria of the European Union to some extent. I mean, Europe is coping with these problems ahead of us, so we follow the EU to some extent. But I guess our idea is we would have a category of full members who are fully free countries and associate members who are not fully free but promised to work towards that. We copy the European Union, the principles of subsidiarity, solidarity, which means we would channel funds towards the more backward economically members, but say the associate members wouldn't qualify until they upgraded themselves to become full members. Anyway, that's a detail.
But what would you do with a country like, I mean, I was talking to John Davenport the other day on another Reboot Dialogue, and we were talking about India and of course also countries like Brazil, and that he reckons that they should be part of a kind of a globalizing democracy alliance, maybe a D10 plus or some kind of other sort of grouping that would try to defend and stand for democracy in the world. But of course, at the moment, India, in so many respects, is moving away from being a democracy. And again, you know, Brazil is going a similar direction. I mean, you could argue that the US is moving away from it for the lack, you know, I mean, you know, if you just look at the recent Supreme Court ruling on abortion and all the rest, you see a trend here, which is very worrying, which is like, you know, established democracies in Europe, in North America, and of course, like others like India, so democracy is quite a flexible, elastic term. And it's hard enough, like on a local scale, to kind of insist on democratic principle and inclusion and all the rest. At a global level, this gets even more difficult. What kind of mechanisms do you foresee, and how do you? I mean, for example, within the European context, Poland and Hungary are clearly kind of undermining the rule of law and developing anti-democratic policies, and the European Commission is now actually penalizing, is withholding funds from Poland and Hungary because of their kind of anti-democratic development. How would you, like at a global level, you know, would there be a way of kind of making sure that we stay democratic, or could countries like India or Brazil or a future US simply derail this, and that it would become indeed that tyranny that we all don't want?
Well, first of all, you know, the US has to be central, I'm afraid, to this. I think in spite of recent events, democracy is very strong there. I have faith that they'll fix these problems. Maybe we'll see the end of Donald Trump before too long, but we'll see. India, yes. I should say John Davenport is a member of our coalition, so he's a major player and a very active member of our coalition. You know, it's very early days for our ideal system. So to some extent, we just follow the EU's procedures. But ideally, I suppose we'd have these categories. First of all, each member would have to apply to join, so they want to be a member of this democratic system. As I say, we'd probably have full members and associate members. And ideally, maybe the group could vote to demote a member to associate membership if they lapsed in their democracy, you know, if they become less than fully free according to the criteria of Freedom House. So that would be one system. I don't know.
Yeah. It seems to be quite. I mean, it seems to be quite an issue at the moment where people are quite worried about fundamental democratic and political rights being eroded, and so I think there's a kind of a natural hesitancy at the moment there. Another question, which is, I find this really fascinating, the work you do, the work people like John do. Because it is at such a high level, and most sort of mere mortals feel that they can hardly imagine themselves as a member of a city council or, you know, like some local representative body, never mind joining a national assembly like a national parliament, or indeed within Europe, you know, the European Commission has this reputation of being quite remote and, you know, inaccessible to ordinary citizens. And indeed in the US, federal government is very often despised at the state level by ordinary people. They feel that federal government is interfering in local affairs and all the rest. But of course, there we're talking existing structures, and there's kind of pathways into political, political office, public office. With what you have in mind as a civil society, as a think tank or like civil society network, you will rely on governments to actually do what you ask them to, because this is not something civil society, like individuals or individual citizens, even if they network together, can do. So how do you, how do you envisage this kind of moving forward? Do you see yourself as a pressure group, or do you see yourself as a nucleus of this new community, or where do you come in as a coalition? For a world security community? What exactly is it, and how does it or can it support that process?
Okay, well, let me tell you a bit of a story. So first of all, let me tell you how we were founded. Basically, a group of us met at the New Shape Forum, an event of the Global Challenges Foundation in Stockholm in 2018. And there they're discussing exactly this problem, how to deal with global challenges, critical global challenges. And we formed a working group, which was supported by the foundation to present at the Paris Peace Forum that year. And we've taken it on from there. So we're basically a transnational working group, about 40 members. And we're pushing this idea, this campaign for world security. Now, why we call it a coalition? Well, we're copying the coalition for the ICC. So you're aware there's a World Federalist Movement, the WFM-IGP, which was led as an executive director by Bill Pace for many years. And he formed this coalition for an ICC, which embraced many civil society organizations, including big ones like Amnesty International, etc. And basically they have won their fight. So the ICC was eventually established. And that's been the greatest achievement so far of the World Federalist Movement. You know, it's only a step on the way, but at least something.
Oh, it's a great step. Yeah, no, totally, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Right. So the movement has always concentrated on reforming the UN, which is the world leading organization we have at the moment. But that's terribly difficult. To alter the charter requires the agreement of 2/3 of the member states and all 5 of the permanent members, including 2 autocracies. And no major change to the charter has ever been achieved. Personally, I think the most likely step forward is the one advocated by Andreas Bummel and the Democracy Without Borders group, who are campaigning for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which would give some sort of democratic voice within the UN, which is actually entirely lacking at the moment. Anyway, that's by the way. So my idea is, as I say, democracy has to be a fundamental principle. So let's start with the democracies. Now, how are we going to do that? How are we going to start? Well, I think, again, we need to copy Europe. Namely, we need to start with a smaller group, such as indeed the D10 that John discussed at the last meeting. So that would involve the G7, basically, plus the members of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. So it would then become a global organization of 10 or so members. If they could agree to do this, they could appoint a commission to go away and draft a treaty, as Jean Monnet and company did, and put it up for approval. And then once they've established this community, they could invite other members. So the rest of the of NATO, for instance, ... So that's, as far as we can see, the most likely sort of global strategy. As you say, we're just a small group of maybe 40 members, and we swing virtually no weight in global councils at the moment. But yes, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, convened by this Alliance of Democracies Foundation in Copenhagen. And it was a very exciting and inspiring event, I have to say. So we heard talks from Zelensky from Ukraine. We heard the Prime Minister of Lithuania, who gave a slashing speech. We heard from Barack Obama. We heard ... anyway, one of the main themes of that meeting was promoting democracy in individual nations, which are threatened or run by autocracy. So places like Venezuela or Cambodia or Cuba or Belarus or Russia itself. So there was, the first day was basically about that. And there was a major feature by Leopoldo Lopez, I think his name is, who's from Venezuela. And his main idea was all those national organizations should get together, form a network of pro-democracy organizations, which would support each other. Together they would carry much more weight than one of them acting alone. They would be able to attract funding and support from other organizations. That sounded to me like a terrific idea. And hopefully that will go ahead. I haven't looked this up, but I think he called it Allied, A-L-L-I-E-D. Anyway, well, it struck me that
would that be a kind of a network organization that the Coalition for World Security Community would join and then work alongside the others, or would you stay separate from this, or what would be your relationship be with that new network you're just mentioning?
Well, I'm just using that as an example. So that would be similar, if you like, to the Coalition for the ICC, which embraced many major civil society organizations. No, I mean, I pat them on the back, good ideas, but that's not our major focus. So I'm saying let's copy that and form a network of organizations aimed at uniting the democracies in an alliance or a community or what have you. So two of the major ones were represented at the meeting, namely the Alliance of Democracies Foundation itself in Europe and the Atlantic Council in the United States. And so, well, both at the summit and afterwards, I've been suggesting to them that they could set up a network, namely a coalition to unite the democracies. And we would be very happy to join them in that larger network. And we help recruit other like-minded organizations. And so put them all together, I think we'd carry much more weight than one organization acting alone. We might even aim to get Amnesty International on board, other, you know, in terms of human rights. Anyway, that I suppose is the current aim to some extent. So that would fit your idea of, you know, where civil society organizations fit in, can help.
That's right. That's right. I mean, in terms of, you know, individual members of the public listening to us, and if they say, "Oh, well, that's interesting. I would like to get involved." Would they? Obviously, they would not get involved with this network, but they would basically pick one of the organizations that are involved and would join those organizations. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I guess individuals would have to join up with their local organization or one of the others. I mean, they're basically all happy to accept individual members, to listen to their, you know, events, take part in their events, support their moves. So the more the merrier. We'd be happy.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. That's right. So what are the kind of the big sort of, if you like, events for the remainder of this year? Big conferences, get-togethers of sort of global organizations like your own. I believe there may well be another democracy summit in the autumn organized by Joe Biden or the US administration. There may be others. What are the kind of the main events in your calendar that are kind of like sort of scheduled for the next 6 to 12 months?
Okay. Well, right now, there's a NATO summit going on. And one possibly would have been that NATO extended to become a global alliance. And I believe that was actually suggested by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, but I guess it was knocked on the head last year by France and Germany, would you believe? They might think again, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So nobody would have believed that last year, but it's happened. But anyway, I think NATO is a bit big. It'd be better to start with a small group, as I say, something like the D10. But Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy is certainly proceeding. I think the second summit meeting is now postponed till next year, early next year. But preparations for it are going on. And we're actually involved in a working group, the Countering Authoritarianism working group. But again, I think it's too large. It's 100-odd nations, some of which are of dubious democracy status. And I think getting agreement from such a large group would be terribly difficult. So again, I think a smaller group should lead the way, but we'll see. We're putting the proposal up to them, and we'll see what they make of it. But as far as I can see, they're again more concerned with promoting democracy within individual nations rather than on the global scale.
Can you do you believe that you can really separate those two issues? I mean, take the US. One of the reasons why the US could take, in my view, could take such a global leadership role after the Second World War was because it was also seen by many, and there was always criticism of one or the other policy, this or the other, or one or the other war. There was Vietnam, there was this and the other. But on the whole, the US was sort of seen as a role model in democracy, the free world, as it used to be called. And this gave it a moral high ground. It kind of basically gave it a mandate to defend and other democracies and to build a sort of, if you like, a global alliance in its own image. You know, if not before, but then certainly during the Trump years, and also what is now happening, sort of after, you know, at the Supreme Court and so forth. A lot of people are questioning whether the US can still have that role model role. Certainly in Europe, European countries have become quite critical of the US and quite worried about the direction the US is taking. So in a way, I mean, for example, John Davenport, he's talking about constitutional reform in the US as well. And so my sense is can you really separate it out? Can you, like, can countries that haven't got their own house in order really kind of raise to the challenge of creating a global democracy alliance, or do you have to start at home first?
Well, I guess it can go on in parallel. I think changing the constitution of the US is a non-starter for a start, but never mind, that's my opinion. I mean, statistics show that democracy has gone backward around the world for the last 15 years or something. So autocracy has been rising, democracy has been going backward. The trends in the US have been mimicked in other countries. So there's been polarization of the political landscape in all countries, the right versus the left, whatever. So I don't think the US is alone there. But still, they do have a strong and functioning democracy. And to some extent, their foreign policy has always been rather bipartisan, right? And that's a general trend also. The countries tend to unite on their foreign policy, even if they diverge.
With the exception of Trump, I mean, you see now Joe Biden is trying to repair much of that foreign policy damage that Donald Trump caused. So I think that was a bit of a diversion. This was a diversion of like a traditional US stance. But yes, that's just a sort of on the side.
Yes, I mean, Donald Trump is an outlier. I mean, personally, I think that shows that the Westminster model, where you don't have a single president running the place, is better than the presidential model, but that's again, a private opinion. Hopefully, Trump is on the downslope. The president inquiry in the Congress is going to do him serious damage, I'd say. So I think he's slowly fading from the landscape, but that's my hope. We'll see. Yes, I mean, that's right, he downgraded NATO, right? He did everything according to this TV show he did. What was it? Involving deals, and you're fired. He'd like to say you're fired. And he applied that method to governing the country, which is incredible.
That's right. So, so you reckon you can? You seem to have quite a strong belief in the sort of the underlying strength of the traditional democracies. That's European democracies, North American democracies, Australian democracy. And you also seem to have quite a lot of faith in Indian and Brazilian democracy. I'm just suggesting that. So you feel that countries may go through their own internal problems and renewal processes, but that to you is quite separate from what you are proposing or what you are saying. You're sort of saying, well, yeah, all of that needs to go on, but building global alliances is it's a different kettle of fish. It's a wholly different domain. And the two things can go in parallel. And even if there are domestic problems piling up, for as long as it doesn't fundamentally damage the kind of the makeup, the constitution of a country, the two can stay separate and can progress at their own pace. Is that kind of correct? Is that how you would see it? You see in some ways the domestic agendas of nation states are almost a distraction in a way from what you want to achieve. Is that a fair comment to make?
Yes, it is. I mean, India is a question. So India is a member of the Quad, right? But, you know, it's very concerned about China, but it has good relations with Russia. So it's refused to join the anti-Russian alliance, whatever. And, it's bought a lot of equipment from Russia. It's still taking Russian exports and so on. So,
and it is sanction breaking. It is not only buying huge quantities of Russian oil, it's also selling it back into Europe, which in another day and age would have been in itself sanctionable. I mean, nobody really dares slapping sanctions now on India, but that really is what people would have to do if they really want to enforce the sanctions in Russia. We kind of don't want to expand the sanction regime. We kind of, we're desperate to kind of not extend or broaden the conflict in that way. But really, if these sanctions are to have any teeth, that's what we would have to do. I mean, imagine anybody would have traded with Iran after the US slapped sanctions on Iran, how the US would have come down on them, yeah? And what we see India doing at the moment, everybody is kind of turning a blind eye because nobody really wants to now start a quarrel with India as well. It's a really difficult situation, and I think India is ruthlessly exploiting it.
Maybe. I mean, that's one of the parallels with the period before World War II. So when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, the League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they didn't work. They didn't stop Mussolini, and I don't think sanctions are going to stop Russia either this time. They can do damage, but they won't stop Russia. At the
moment, they do almost more damage to Europe and the US, actually to Europe more than the US, than to Russia. They've backfired in a spectacular way.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, they're more effective, I suppose, than the League of Nations was. The League of Nations actually collapsed, right, after that sanctions incident. But anyway, where were we? Yes, I mean, so I'm not sure India would be suitable as at least a starting member of the community, but it would probably be happy to join later because it's very concerned about China. I mean, it has actual conflict situations in the north with China, in Nepal, well, not Nepal, but the dividing line.
Well, I suppose the problem isn't so much India as such, it's really Modi, because Modi is like the sort of Hindu nationalism that he stands for, and that he promotes in a really kind of rather aggressive way, is quite anti-democratic, even if the kind of Indian constitution and kind of traditions, democratic traditions, hold the country together still quite well. It's a bit like, you know, when the US came under strain under Trump, you wouldn't want to have had the US under Trump lead a democracy initiative. And in the same way, you wouldn't want India under Modi to lead a democracy initiative. It just wouldn't, it would really would be a problem.
Yes, that's right. I mean, India for a long time was a leader of the non-aligned movement, right? So didn't want to choose either the East or the West. And of course, there's this problem with the Muslims. They're being persecuted to some extent in India. That's right. So that's a problem. But Japan, Australia, South Korea, I guess, maybe New Zealand, not a big country, but a very thriving democracy, could all be initial members of the group. Anyway,
yes,
that's
absolutely.
Going to be up to.
And certainly, I mean, I think the situation in Ukraine and Taiwan do give impetus to this. So, I mean, when I'm kind of being kind of standoffish a little bit in our dialogue today, it's not that I don't believe in it. I totally do. It's just I do see all these hurdles, and I'm quite frustrated that I don't really see a smooth way through it. You know, I don't. I can see, yes, it would be great to have this kind of, you know, country, this alliance, including kind of India, Brazil, the G7, but I can see, you know, we're going through such a difficult time at the moment that it's as much about damage limitation and preparing the ground as it is about building something new. It's almost as if we have to, in a way, get through this current period before we can really seriously kind of, you know, do this. And of course, the midterms are coming up in the US. You know, like the Democrats might be doing rather badly, and they might lose control, you know, of Congress. So, you know, Joe Biden might become quite a lame duck president in his, you know, for the last 2 years, and he may well lose the next election, and we might have another Trumpist figure there. So we are in a really difficult situation in a global context. There's a global recession on the rise, and that always turns countries inwards. So, I mean, from your kind of sort of high level perspective, where do you see the low-hanging fruits? I mean, what do you think your coalition for world security community would want to achieve in the short term, just to slowly edge forward in the right direction? What is the sort of the short-term, low-hanging fruit objective that you're aiming for?
Okay, well, I think we need to work towards this D10 idea. So start with the G7, which is headed by Germany at the moment. If we could convince Germany to put it on the agenda, I think is the G7 summit coming up? No, or it's recently
happening right now, yeah.
Yes, so it's too late to get into the summit, but Germany is in charge of or leading the G7 for the rest of this year, right? So what I'd like to see ideally is if we could persuade Germany to put on the agenda for a meeting later. And as I say, just appoint a commission to start drafting a possible treaty. Doesn't have to be adopted right away, but let's start thinking about the shape of this organization. The US has its problems, but again, on foreign policy, we can look for a bipartisan agreement. So in fact, we need it. For the US to agree to a new treaty, it needs 2/3 of the Congress to vote in favor, right? Or the Senate, the Senate. Well, that means both parties have to agree. Well, the Republicans have always been pretty strong on national security, so I don't see why they should object to this idea. Anyway, we have to wait.
The thing is, I'm not, I said this to John, it's quite interesting that Germany has such a great reputation abroad. Germany couldn't care less about human rights for anybody but Germans. I mean, Germany wants to do business with China. It's the biggest export market. Germany was really dragging its feet on Russian gas and oil. And the moment there's a peace agreement signed, Olaf Scholz will be back in Russia, shaking hands with Putin and doing business in Russia. Germany is first and foremost interested about itself economically. There is, in my view, there's two aspects to this. One is that, Germany is a very, very young country. It didn't really have a foreign policy until unification, because it was occupied. It hadn't regained its full sovereignty until reunification in 1990. It's a very young country. It doesn't have experience. It really puts its own prosperity ahead of anything else, absolutely ahead of anything else, ahead of anybody else's suffering, ahead of European Union, ahead of absolutely everything. And there's a historic reason to this. There's a sort of a strong belief in Germany that prosperity is closely linked to social order. And if social order breaks down, there's this kind of almost irrational fear that we're back to a kind of fascist or identitarian or whatever kind of the thing that we all Germans try to leave behind. So there's this sort of sense we have to, and this is obviously the whole Marshall Plan in a way was built on this kind of premise. Let's make Germany successful again, so that it kind of basically, and so there's a whole thing about a close link in people's minds between social order and prosperity. And Olaf Scholz will make this very clear that he's not going to do anything that will kind of in any way sort of compromise or sacrifice Germany's prosperity. I mean, I kind of wonder what that might make Americans think. I mean, this never seems to really reach the US. If it would, the US would instantly kind of turn down, because, I mean, if you think about Ukraine, the amount of money the US has been transferring to Ukraine and compare that to what Europe is doing, it's just disproportionate. A much more interesting person, I think, to take this idea forward is Macron. In France, for a number of reasons. A, France has a capable foreign service. They are a military nation. They are a nuclear country. They are very much at the forefront of Europeanizing their nuclear arsenal so that Europe can build up its defenses and the whole sort of integration of an integrated defense policy. France is very much at the center of that. Macron has basically lost his absolute majority in the French parliament now. So he is quite diminished at a domestic level, but it doesn't really touch his foreign policy so much. So Macron would have the space and also the ambition and the expertise in a French Foreign Office to really take something like that forward. I think to hope that Germany will do this is banking entirely on the wrong horse. Germany will talk nice because they want to do business also with Australia. They want to do business with everybody. Hey, let's be nice to each other. We'll do business. And they do this with kind of China at a level where I feel ashamed, but hey, it's German prosperity, and that comes first. And so this idea and the G7, Germany will agree to anything that makes it richer, but it'll not agree to anything that will in any way have a negative impact on its banking or on its industrial base. And this has been to the detriment of the EU in the past. I mean, we think about the financial crisis of 2007-8, the way Germany kind of really treated Greece, Spain, Italy, and so moving forward and as a democracy alliance would mean that you have to place values alongside economic policy. And Germany, don't think at an international level, is anywhere near prepared to do this. Yeah, they'll do talk the talk. And every time a German politician goes to China, says, oh yeah, and we will mention human rights. But that's as far as it goes. They still build factories there. They're still it's the main export market for them. And they will not do anything that will antagonize China. And it'll be very, very interesting to see if China was ever to attack Taiwan, what Germany's position would be on that. Unless they really have pulled out of China at that stage to such an extent that they don't rely on it economically anymore. But at the moment, a bit like with Russia, to this day, Germany has not sent a single heavy weapon to Ukraine, not a single one. It's absolutely shameful, disgraceful. of course, there's all this talk about, oh, yes, of course, we send weapons, but they're all like handguns, helmets, things that really don't help in the current war against Russia. Germany does not want to really get into an argument with Russia. Germany wants to basically back to business as usual once this conflict, and they are convinced that Ukraine will lose. So in fact, the US was as well at the very beginning. Yeah, I mean, they kind of offered Zelensky to flee, to get board a plane, and said, no, thank you, send me weapons, send me bullets. He wanted to stay, and Germany takes the very same position. There's a big discourse here in Germany that says, well, I mean, let's be honest, Ukraine can't win this. We just prolong the suffering. This is the kind of discourse you get in Germany. So relying on Germany for a democracy alliance that would place values along economic development is, at the moment, the political will simply isn't here. I don't see it.
Okay, well, that's depressing. But I mean, on the other hand, Germany has been the leader of the EU for yonks, right? So it's funded the EU.
But a lot of countries in the EU, this has been one of the major reasons why the UK withdrew, see Europe as a German colony. I mean, Germany, Germany's monetary policy in the EU. I mean, there's issues around sort of, socializing sovereign debt. Germany is absolutely against Eurobonds. Germany is about anything that would raise the value of the euro, that would kind of stabilize and create. Germany almost needs, as its economic model, needs kind of crisis on the margin of Europe. It needs a depressed Greece, it needs to depress Italy, a depressed Spain, because it keeps the euro down and it keeps German exports competitive. And this thing about the kind of the majority voting in Europe, it's not the case. I mean, it's all based on unanimity, and you see this every time German economic interests are in any way threatened. Germany will always act in its own and not in European interests. At the moment, give an example. At the moment, Germany wants to spend 100 billion. Yes, set aside 100 billion, just a huge amount, 100 billion euro on building up its defenses. This would be the death nail for a European defense strategy. Germany, if they really want to do something, they should be handing this 100 billion into a European pot. But Germany doesn't want to do that, because then you'd have defense contractors in Italy, Spain, France spending German money to basically build arms. They want to spend 100 billion on German industry to build its own thing up. And if it happens, it'd be a minimal. It'll absolutely have a detrimental effect on the kind of the current, which is very strong at the moment, the building up of the European army. But if Germany wants to go alone, and that's the signal it's sending it at the moment by saying we're going to spend all this money on ourselves, that'd be detrimental. So I think Germany really needs to come a long way. I mean, when Macron kind of won his first term in office, he had a wonderful reform agenda for the EU. And Angela Merkel basically killed every single one of his proposals along the way. This is partially why he was kind of so diminished, and what undermined his credibility, over the time, because he set himself out as a cosmopolitan, outward-looking European president. And this was absolutely batted back by Angela Merkel. Every single one of his proposals were killed by Germany. And so I think Macron would be a great figure to take a sort of a D10 from a European context forward. And I think Germany may follow in this. Germany may kind of, but they will not, and they will, if they're forced to, they will, as well, but they will not voluntarily sacrifice economic growth or exports or anything in the name of democracy or anything else. So it's unfortunate, but that's really where Germany seems to stand at the moment, for all the talk.
Can I just comment? So you may be right, and we approach Macron as well, but I mean, everybody after the fall of the Soviet Union was thinking, liberal democracy had won the way, won the debate. Russia would become democratic and join the West, basically. And they rushed, as you say, to form economic relations and trade with Russia. And Angela Merkel, I suppose, was a large part of that. So I don't think Germany was alone in those ideas, but it maybe continued a bit longer than the others to cling to that idea. So that's the way I see it. Anyway.
But
so
by the way, Germany continued to increase exports to Russia between January this year and May this year. Increase when Europe as a whole decreased exports to Russia by 11%. Germany increased. They stepped in and took over some of those exports. Germany has massively benefited the Russian economy during that period.
Really?
So they have not pulled back voluntarily. Yes, they have kept the sanction regime, but they have used all channels and all means and possibilities to export in other areas where the sanctions weren't actually, restricting trade. So Germany is very much focused on that, and it's totally misunderstood. I think internationally, it's sort of seen as this benevolent, social democratic country. Yeah, that's very true if you're German. I mean, even in the previous regimes in Germany, Germans, were treated kind of well if they were kind of, I don't want to go there, but I'm just saying Germany is really kind of, I think, to its own, very good, but that's kind of where it tends to draw the line. Certainly when it comes to human rights and when it comes to political or any other rights, there's very little comprehension why the German state. You get NGOs, Reporters Without Borders. They're very big in Germany. They do loads of good work. You get Amnesty has got a large base in Germany. Open Society Foundation is now based in Germany as well. You get many of these civil society organizations that are doing quite well and that receive also good funding, a lot of funding from Germany, no question. But the German government, the German state official policy is very different in that respect. It's very much basically saying Germany first and always has.
Okay, that's rather unfortunate, but anyway, maybe we can convince them to follow on. By the way, have you programmed Andreas Bummel to give you a talk sometime?
No, but tell me about him briefly.
Well, he's devoted his whole life to this idea of reforming the UN, basically, and he's, again, proposing a modest start, a stage-by-stage process. So he's proposing a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which could be set up by a mere vote of the General Assembly and doesn't require any change of the Charter. So all he has to do is persuade a majority of the General Assembly to approve it. And initially it would just have an advisory role. So it would be made up of parliamentarians from the member states, and it would give advisory opinions on various issues to the General Assembly. But the idea is that over time it would be given more powers and eventually become an actual parliament, a democratic voice within the UN. So that's the hope.
That sounds an interesting guy to talk to. But Chris, getting back to the coalition of World Security Committee, I'm quite conscious that I have been today blogging a little bit, and this is to do with my own frustrations, really much more than with what you guys are doing, because I think it's brilliant and it's really, really important. So I do think that the D10 idea is a great one as a sort of a stepping stone thing, and of course this kind of civil society network that in a way would mirror what the D10 does, but at a civil society level, and that the two could work together. I think that is a very powerful potential, and you say, and this is an interesting kind of thought, that it mirrors in some ways the kind of the campaigns that enabled the ICC eventually to be formed and established. I think that's a very, very interesting idea. So I'm conscious of time. So looking ahead over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, Chris, what are the kind of the next sort of steps that you, as the president of the Coalition for World Security Community, are hoping to take to move both your own movement, but also these other kind of initiatives forward?
Yes, well, as I say, I've sent emails just in the last couple of weeks, basically since the Copenhagen summit, to the Atlantic Council and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, asking whether they would think this idea of a network, a coalition to unite the democracies, is a good idea. So I'm hoping to persuade them to lead the way. I mean, they have much more personnel, resources, etc., than we do, or virtually anybody else. You know, the Atlantic Council basically was formed originally perhaps to put forward the ideas of Clarence Streit. So he proposed in 1939, I think, a union of the democracies. In that case, to combat, would you believe, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. But after the war, he modified the proposal, first of all, to combat Soviet Russia, but then as the first step towards a world federation. So, you know, he, in the end, in the final stage of his ideas, he was quite close to what we're proposing now. And the Atlantic Council, Ash Jane and Matthew Kronig, and Jonas Perello-Plesner, that's right, from the Copenhagen Foundation, have written a joint paper which basically advocates very much what we're saying.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so that's there's a clear direction there then, yeah?
Yes. So if we can persuade them to set up this network, then I think they'd have a much more persuasive voice in the geopolitical councils of the world. Meanwhile, I'm proposing to try and persuade the Australian government, for instance, to support these ideas. We have a new Australian government.
Yes, historically, yes. Very nice.
Yes, we should send letters to Germany and etc. The UK, I think, would jump on board. Yeah, who knows? So
obviously, the new government in Australia will. I mean, you know, I mean, Australia had a rather dismal record on climate, for example, under the previous government, so I mean, this is of course one area where the new government can really make good for some of the errors and some of the policies of the previous government. Do you see the new government helpful in ways that would benefit the coalition for a world security community? Do you see a direct kind of in their foreign policy?
Well, it remains to be seen to some extent. I mean, I'm very glad the new Labor government has come in. They're certainly going to be much more active on climate change, which is, you know, way past time here. On foreign affairs, well, as I say, Australia has a pretty bipartisan view. So both sides of politics have basically supported each other in terms of the Australian attitude. But the Labor foreign minister and defence ministers have in the past been, well, trying to accommodate China, trying to maintain good relations with China. But on the other hand, they've, you know, we're being boycotted by China because of our tough attitudes. Well, the new government has maintained those tough attitudes and said it will not give in to the 14-point demands or whatever of China. We've got a rock-solid alliance with the United States. So if war broke out over Taiwan, we'd be involved. Not that we could help a great deal at present. And we're worried about that. And also, you may have seen recently, China's foreign minister has been visiting the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu and Solomon Islands and so on, and proposing pacts which haven't yet been approved by the Pacific Islands. So that's been a major concern for Australia and New Zealand. This is off the track, but I and others have been proposing for some time that the Pacific Islands Forum should be again upgraded to a community, which could formulate a common security policy for the whole group. And that would be a great step forward in fending off, if you like, the Chinese strategy in the Pacific.
Absolutely.
They're spending a lot of money on development of various sorts, which is fine, except for this debt trap. So they demand repayment of all these funds, and the countries find it difficult to repay and find themselves basically trapped. So they need to get off that course. Development funds on their own would be a great idea. Yeah.
Just one last question there in terms of sort of a strategy. We both seem to be making this implicit assumption that for a sort of a coalition of nations to form, both the US and Europe, or particular countries within Europe, are critically important for this to take off. This is probably the case. I mean, I'm not questioning that, but I just, as a thought experiment, I wonder. Well, first of all, the question: why is that? Is that because pride and whatever kind of a sense of superiority would prevent them from joining later? That they would sort of say, "Oh, well, it's not our initiative," if they're not in it from the beginning. Or are there other reasons why you think that they have to essentially be seen as the leaders of this? Because you could equally take another approach. I mean, countries like, for example, like New Zealand, very small, not very powerful, but really decent countries, and you know, in so many ways, role models for what countries should be. You know, if you'd get together like a small band of countries like that, really you take the best of breed, the kind of really countries that are, you know, sorted out, and you start there and you build it up slow, if you like, from the ground up. I know this probably wouldn't work, but just as a thought experiment, why is this not being even contemplated?
Well, I mean, the idea is, if you're going to fend off World War III, basically, if you're going to deter China, for instance, from invading Taiwan, I mean, it's building up its forces as fast as it can go. It's building airfields opposite Taiwan. It's obviously planning to go as soon as possible, maybe within 3 years, according to some experts. If you like to take the US by surprise, its allies. So to deter them, we need as powerful a coalition or whatever as possible. So as I say, if you include North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, the major nations there, as I say, would involve half the world's GDP, 2/3 of the world's military expenditure. It would basically be unchallengeable. And so that would, in other words, that would form a credible deterrent and would dissuade China, say, from attacking across that state. So that's the aim, right? We don't want war to break out. We want to prevent it. And we have to form as powerful an alliance as we can.
Okay, so the very last question leading on from that, that's a very tangible objective, and I can totally, you know, share that. You know, that's. But if this is the absolute objective here, why bother about democracy? I mean, in other words, if it is a question about building an alliance against aggression, I mean, for example, you know, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, at the G7 that's been on, I think it's ending today or has ended yesterday, at Schloss Elmau here in Germany, the big G7 gathering. In his speech, he basically said, "Oh, we need to get away from this old Cold War thinking. We need to break away from this East-West thinking." And Germany wants to lead a way, basically, where countries that are abiding by international law and the rule of law would be teaming together against countries who don't. But when you have that as your principle, and it just shows how inexperienced and Olaf Scholz really is when it comes to foreign policy or any of that, then the US has broken international law. I had an illegal war in Iraq. The UK is doing it right now with an Northern Protocol. I don't know about Australia, but I mean, like, there's so many countries. In fact, there isn't a single industrialized country that hasn't kind of disregarded. You could go on with Israel. You could go on with this, with that, the other. There's so many countries who have. So if you're basically saying we only bring together countries who haven't broken international law, which is kind of Olaf Scholz's kind of vision now, then you may even bring in China, actually, because I'm not sure whether they actually have broken international law so far. And it's a totally different axis that Olaf Scholz has in mind, the law-abiding nations versus the kind of the law-breaking nations. This is different from the democracies versus the autocracies. It's a totally different axis. But of course, it's very clear why he wants it, because the rule of law is fundamental for Germany's pursuit of profit, because you need the supremacy of contract law to enforce your economic interests. And this is why law is so fundamental to Germany and not democracy, but that's just on one side. But if it's about preventing war, why not run with Olaf Scholz's definition and say, forget about democracy, what really matters is rule of law. It doesn't matter whether, we're not talking human rights here, we're talking international law, and we're talking, like rule of law nationally. So, I mean, even a country like Russia, okay, with Ukraine, it broke international law, it's a war of aggression, but no more so than Iraq, as far as the US was concerned. So it becomes really quite problematic. So taking your idea, if it's about making sure that if China attacks Taiwan, or now also with Ukraine, we need to build an alliance that this kind of geopolitical aggression on that scale can no longer happen, that world wars are being prevented. Democracy may or may not have to be a part of this. I mean, I think it should be. I totally, don't get me wrong, but that's just as a thought experiment. Why are you insisting on democracy there if the objective really is about stopping China from attacking Taiwan?
Okay. I guess that's possible. I haven't seen the statement, but I mean, I'm a theorist, right? I'm a theoretical physicist. In theory, democracy, as I've said, is going to be a necessary, fundamental principle of any world federation. So I'm proposing that. And this East-West divide was breaking down, as we said, post-Soviet Union collapse. But it's been reinstated by Russia. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine has absolutely violated any international law and violated the peace of Europe, right? So Europe is outraged, basically. So it's Russia and its ally, if you like, China. So they formed an axis, like Italy and Germany did before World War II.
That's right.
So they've done it themselves. And, the invasion of Ukraine has smashed every international agreement and law. I mean, I agree, Iraq was basically a mistake, George W. Bush and so on. And no country is absolutely free of blame. We all make mistakes. But the democracies are generally much more peaceful. You can statistically verify this. And they almost never make war against each other. If we want a peaceful world, we need democracy, basically.
I'm totally with you on the democracy thing. I'm just saying for me, there's two separate objectives here. There is a kind of democratizing a world for a long-term objective of a more peaceful, a more just, a more sustainable world. It's absolutely clear. It would be horrific to have a world government that isn't democratic. So we're absolutely on the same sheet here. But this is a sort of a set of objectives that leads to a democratic world in the future. There's a much shorter term. You're talking about a time frame of 3 years here, where China might attack, Taiwan, and that's on a different timeline, and it has a different set of objectives attached to that, which may or may not have to do with democracy. And so the question to me is whether the two have to be the same thing. I think what you're sort of saying is strategically it makes sense to bring them together because it gives impetus to a kind of a international body that would coordinate peacekeeping and security in a democratic way. I can totally see the rationale and the logic, the kind of the strategic thinking behind that. But of course, in traditional kind of military thinking, what you may want to say is, well, actually, we need to beef up NATO so that NATO is ready when China attacks Taiwan. That would be a very pragmatic, short term. We have 3 years to basically kind of build our infrastructure, because as you say, China is building its infrastructure as we speak. And if we don't kind of catch up with this, and if we don't keep an eye on this, then we will be at a significant disadvantage when they do attack Taiwan. So that's, that's basically, for me, they're kind of this short-term 3 to 5 year window where Taiwan might be threatened by China, and there's a sort of a 5 to 50 year kind of agenda, which is a very different timeline, which is about kind of creating a different kind of world. Do you think that these two necessarily need to be brought into a single framework, or can you see how they could possibly be dealt with separately?
Well, you know, I was thinking about this community. I wrote a book 20 years ago where I talked about this idea of a community of democracy. So I've always thought that, but it might be possible to start with a different group. I mean, which countries would he propose? Which countries would you propose?
Well, what kind of got me thinking on this was that if my objective was to democratize the world and to build a government, one option would be to start with the New Zealands of this world and to basically take countries that are really democracies in the best sense, and to build it slowly out from there. And over the next 50 years, we might end up having something. And at some point, larger countries might join and so on and so forth. It might become a matter of prestige to be part of this because you want to be as good at democracy as others. But of course, that would not be a military approach, would it? Because you would, for a long time, you would be actually not very strong in terms of militarily or not even economically. You'd be sort of just a kind of an idealist experiment in a way. But in terms of building that world, that could be a possibility. Whereas if the objective is to basically be ready for a war in 3 years' time, then that's a very, very different timeline. And one would want this to be as democratic as it can be. You know, there's no question about that. But it may not be the primary concern. The primary concern might be the defense of Taiwan, defense of Australia, and the prevention of of a third world war. And so for me, the two are not necessarily. I don't know the answer. I'm just saying, you know, it's like in a way for me, these are two very viable concerns. And I can totally see the idea of why bringing them together might actually accelerate the formation of a world body, because the ends must meet. You know, there's a sort of a kind of a dynamic here. There's a sort of and that obviously you want to piggyback on that and you want to use that. And I think that's right. That's what we have to do. But it's that. And so, but it also means that because the driver behind that dynamic is fear of war in Taiwan, we may have to compromise along the way, because that primary objective to prevent the war must in some ways be more important, or prioritized over the secondary objective of it becoming democratic. I don't know, in a way that the two are not necessarily always in lockstep.
Well, maybe not. I think an alliance basically would be a major step forward too. So an alliance which doesn't necessarily, I mean, which are the non-democratic countries which you think we might attract, put it like that, would be useful to have?
India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia.
Well, Indonesia's fairly democratic, I think.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, this is exactly the thing. You know, Philippines.
Philippines, yes.
Yeah,
I mean, this is, one would hope to attract all these at a later stage. I suppose that's the idea. On their own, without the G7, for instance, you wouldn't have the impressive array that would form a credible deterrent. So we basically need the G7.
We need the G7 and ideally bump it up to a G10. And as you said, if the Atlantic Council would sort of kind of go into partnership with the Foundation of Democracy, what do you call it? Foundation of Democracies?
Alliance of Democracies Foundation.
Alliance of Democracies Foundation. If the two of them would team together and a larger network would build around that, of course, the Coalition for a World Security Community would be one of those members then as well, and would have a seat at the table, which would be brilliant. I think that's a really interesting model. And of course, as you said, in parallel, NATO might be bumped up and might develop further as well to prevent in the short term whatever conflicts. So what kind of When do you hope to hear back from the Atlantic Council and the foundation?
Well, I don't know. I'm waiting. They may ignore me entirely. Who knows? But I'm hoping for a response. So I can let you know if you like.
Oh, would be very nice. And presumably you do have. I know that you know people at the Atlantic Council personally. So you presumably have written to those people, and so your name will be. It won't be a cold call. They know who's writing to them, and it would be quite unfriendly if they weren't responding at least to say thanks, Chris, but no thanks. I think that's the very least you would get, given your relationship with them, which is a very positive and a very strong one. But yeah, let's hope that this moves forward. What did you indicate a sort of a wish for a time frame on this when you talk to them, or what is your sense if they were to go for this? How quickly could something like that happen?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't see why they shouldn't be able to set it up within months, but they'd have to tell me. Yes, so the Copenhagen summit was very good. I met a number of these people face to face, and we generally agreed. I talked to Derek Mitchell of the National Democratic Institute, which is another powerful civil society organization with US government support. I just said a few words to him at the summit. I followed up with an email, and in the email he found it sounded much more doubtful. He said probably the US wouldn't agree, so here's another problem. They won't agree to any restriction of their sovereignty, which is, the first hurdle anybody has to surmount in setting up a federation or any sort of political organization. And he may be right, so we may trip over that hurdle right away. I don't know, but as I say, both sides are bipartisan in security terms, basically. I hope he's wrong. The US in a community would have the largest say, but not a dominant say. So they would be the major partner in the alliance, but not a dominant partner in the community.
Well, isn't this why the Security Council was sort of established in the first place as well, so that these grand nations would have a veto on issues that infringe on their sovereignty in any way.
Exactly. So that's why it becomes completely inoperative. So it's had no influence on the Vietnam War because it involved the major powers. And it's having no real influence on the Ukrainian war because members of the Security Council are involved on both sides. So the one exception was the Korean War, right? So the Security Council authorized the US to intervene in the Korean War, and that was because the Soviet Union made a mistake and boycotted the meeting of the Security Council rather than attending it and vetoing it. So that was the only time the UN actually authorized, if you like, intervention in a war involving the permanent members. So that's just a major illustration of why the UN is ineffective on these matters.
That's right, but maybe the same of course goes for the EU. Again, the principle of unanimity is killing the EU at the moment because any country can instantly at any point can say no, and then decisions just aren't taken forward. So the qualified majority voting is something people are pushing very strongly at the moment for sort of a constitutional reform in Europe, that this becomes possible. And for as long as unanimity remains as a principle, it remains a confederation rather than a federation. And that's of course a huge problem for it to go forward. But in a way, there are examples, of course, in the way the US formed, and in its sort of constitutional history, the EU is going through that process. Your colleague who's trying to reform the UN is trying to find a back route to move beyond that obstacle. And I think any new structure that would be set up probably would again have to start making that concession initially just to get the people around the table. And then, of course, I would have to find in the process over time, and we have to find ways of overcoming that. I think if one would make that a kind of a deal breaker from the start, you're absolutely right, then probably it would never happen. But I think initially you would have to give every one of those countries a veto, otherwise they would never allow themselves to be involved in it.
Well, yes, except for the alliance. So they would have to agree to an Article 5, if you like. An attack on one is an attack on all, and they have to resist it. For other decisions, what to do about climate change, what, other problems, yes.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the kind of but there's a precedent with NATO, and that obviously it's very much at the heart of it. That's why Article 5 is accepted, because without that there would be no NATO. I mean, really, that's been really, really interesting, Chris. I hope me being sort of a bit standoffish or didn't get that wrong. I really do think it's really amazing what you do. Really important to move forward with it. I'll be following very, very closely, and yes, do please keep me in the loop. What comes back from the Atlantic Council and from the foundation, to sort of see whether there's something. And of course, in an ideal world, if we maybe have another chat in 6-7 months' time, coming up to Christmas, maybe by that stage we have a clearer picture of where they stand and whether this is a possible route. I mean, of course, part of Reboot 2030 is that, I mean, if you listen to the other interviews we're doing, the other kind of dialogues we're doing, every single or the vast majority of these projects are now impossible to realize. And this is why we do Reboot. I mean, if it was so easy, these are very bright people trying to do impossible things at a time when really it is very important to do these things. And it's not, nobody would expect a coalition of a world security community emerge within 6 or 12 months time. This is a 10-year project in a way. So I'm totally, and even if there's short initial kind of like movements, there's going to be 2 steps forwards and 1 step back, and it's going to be like a bumpy road for some time to come. But it's really amazing that you do this and that you guys exist. So I'd like to catch up with you in 6 months' time if you're up for it, and hopefully by that stage we have a clearer picture of where everybody stands. We'll also kind of know, Germany's presidency of the G7, how that worked out. As I said, I don't hold out too much hope that they will be pushing anything else but economic agendas, but we shall see. And hopefully we will have a better sense of where things are going, and kind of a good conversation then about that.
Right. Well, thanks, Nico. It's very interesting to have this conversation, and very good to have your objections, if you like. So yes, it's very good to have your ideas and have to try and answer them. Who knows? Yeah, let's see in 6-8 months. That'd be good.
Absolutely. And we're not beyond Corona yet, so do stay healthy. We just had our 4th our 2nd booster, our 4th shot. I don't know what's the situation in Australia. Are you kind of boosted? Are you getting boosters in Australia as well, or what's the story there?
Yes, we're all had 2 shots plus a booster. They're talking about a 4th one, whether it's really necessary or not. My brother-in-law is in intensive care at the moment with COVID, so we're all in the same boat as regards this. But so we all need to stay healthy where we can. We need to stay healthy, stay careful, because we have important work to do, and obviously we can only do it for as long as we kind of have the strength to do it. Chris, thank you very, very much. It's been such a great pleasure to see you again in good health, and I look forward to continuing that conversation in the future. Thanks, Nico. Right. Thank you very much. See you later. Bye-bye.